Somewhere in England, in a palace so enormous it has its own lake, its own bridge, its own gravitational field of inherited arrogance, a woman sat alone. She was not old, not yet, but she had already done the unthinkable. This is Gladys Marie Deacon. At the turn of the 20th century, she was considered, by painters, by poets, by princes, to be perhaps the most beautiful woman in Europe. Marcel Proust wrote about her. Auguste Rodin sketched her. The Crown Prince of Germany proposed to her twice. And then she injected liquid paraffin wax into the bridge of her own nose. Because a duke had once, casually, remarked that she had a slightly low nasal bridge, and she needed to be perfect. For him, the wax migrated. Over years it calcified, hardened, disfigured the very face the world had called divine. By the time she was in her 40s, the woman who had commanded the attention of Europe's most powerful men sat behind locked doors in a palace she had sacrificed everything to enter, estranged, ridiculed, and slowly disappearing. This is not a love story. It was never a love story. What happened to Gladys Deacon is the story of what the aristocratic marriage market, the dollar princess economy, the transactional unions of the Gilded Age, does to a woman's body, her mind, and her sense of self when she makes the catastrophic mistake of believing that entry into the palace means entry into power. She was brilliant. She was radically independent for her era. She spoke 5 languages. She debated philosophy with Berenson and beauty with Proust. And the system consumed her anyway. Tonight, we are going inside the walls of Blenheim Palace, and we are not coming out until we understand exactly how it happened. Not just to Gladys, but why it was always going to happen to someone. To understand Gladys Deacon, you have to understand the world she was born into, and how carefully that world was designed to look like freedom while functioning as a cage. The year is 1881. Gladys is born in Paris to an American father, Edward Parker Deacon, a Boston Brahmin with money, volatility, and a catastrophically bad temper. Her mother, Florence, was a socialite of dazzling beauty and equally dazzling recklessness. The family moved in the highest circles of European aristocracy. They were American, but aspirationally, desperately European. This is important. File it away. Because the late 19th century had produced a very particular and very grotesque social phenomenon: the dollar princess. The mathematics were simple and merciless. British and European aristocratic families had the titles, the castles, the social pedigree built over centuries. But they were catastrophically, structurally broke. Agricultural revenues had collapsed. The cost of maintaining ancestral estates was medieval in scale. The aristocracy was asset-rich and cash-poor, sitting on hundreds of rooms they could not afford to heat. American industrialists, meanwhile, had the opposite problem. Men like Vanderbilt, Astor, Carnegie had generated fortunes so obscene that no amount of conspicuous consumption could spend them fast enough. But in America's rigid social hierarchy of the Gilded Age, new money was new money. Vulgar, trade, untitled. And so the transaction was formalized.
American heiresses would provide the cash transfusions that kept the aristocratic estates from collapse. In return, they received a title, a hyphenated name, invitations to things. They were called dollar princesses, a term that sounds like a fairy tale and was, in practice, closer to a controlled acquisition. Between 1870 and 1914, over 100 American women married into the British aristocracy. The total wealth transferred, in today's terms, runs into the billions.
The most famous of these transactions, and we should call it that, was the 1895 marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt to the 9th Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill, Blenheim Palace. £2.5 million settlement, roughly $300 million in today's money. Consuelo's mother, Alva Vanderbilt, wanted the title. Consuelo, by her own later testimony, was essentially coerced into the marriage. She wept at the altar. The guests mistook her tears for emotion. Now enter Gladys Deacon. Gladys met the Duke of Marlborough, Charles, the 9th Duke, when she was 15 years old. He was already married to Consuelo. Gladys was a guest at Blenheim, and something began. A friendship, an intellectual flirtation, a long, slow obsession that would take decades to fully detonate. Here is the dark irony at the center of this entire story. Gladys Deacon was not a dollar princess in the traditional sense. She was not being sold by a calculating mother to a strategically selected duke. She chose this. She pursued the duke. She wanted, with the full force of her extraordinary intellect and will, to enter this world. In her letters from this period, Gladys writes with the unsettling self-awareness of someone who believes she is the exception to every rule. She is not being married off, she reasons. She is selecting. She is an agent, not a commodity. She was right in the sense that mattered least, and catastrophically wrong in the sense that mattered most. Because the system she was entering did not care about her agency. It had no mechanism to register it. The walls of Blenheim Palace were not built to accommodate a woman with opinions. They were built to absorb women's resources and neutralize their power. And the palace had been doing that for 200 years before Gladys ever walked through the door. Let's talk about the wax. Because the wax is not a sidebar. The wax is the entire story, compressed into a single act of desperate, heartbreaking self-modification. Sometime in the early 1900s, the exact date is disputed, which is itself telling, because no one wanted to write it down. Gladys Deacon underwent a procedure. She had liquid paraffin wax injected into the bridge of her nose to alter its profile, to heighten it slightly, to achieve, in her own estimation, a closer approximation to the classical Greek ideal she had studied obsessively in her reading of ancient sculpture. This was not an uncommon procedure in this period. Paraffin wax injections were a fashionable, if deeply misunderstood, form of early cosmetic surgery among the European elite. Doctors who should have known better administered them freely. The long-term consequences were not yet understood, or rather, they were not yet admitted. Here is the physiological reality. Paraffin wax, when injected into soft tissue, does not stay where it is placed. Over time, it migrates. It follows gravity. It accumulates. It calcifies. The medical term for the late-stage result is paraffinoma, a granulomatous foreign body reaction. The tissue hardens around the wax into nodular masses. The original shape, the shape that was the entire point, is destroyed by the very intervention designed to perfect it.
Gladys Deacon spent years watching this happen in the mirror. But here is the question we must ask, the question that transforms this from a medical curiosity into a psychological excavation. Why? Not why did the wax migrate? Why did she do it in the first place? Gladys Deacon was, by every account, already extraordinary looking. The portraits confirm it. The written testimony of everyone who met her confirms it. This is not a woman who was conventionally insecure about her appearance in the way the word insecure implies. This is a woman who had absorbed, at a cellular level, the fundamental lesson of the world she inhabited. Your value is your face, not your mind, not your 5 languages, not your correspondence with Proust, not your philosophical arguments, not your burning, restless intelligence that contemporary accounts describe with a kind of bewildered awe, as if they couldn't quite believe it was real. Your face, your body, your physical proximity to an impossible, shifting, culturally mandated ideal of feminine perfection. And she had been told, perhaps once, perhaps repeatedly, perhaps just once in the offhand way that men with power say things that they immediately forget, and women never do, that her nose was slightly low. She was still waiting for the Duke, you see. Consuelo Vanderbilt and the 9th Duke of Marlborough separated in 1906. Their marriage had been, in Consuelo's own words, in her autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold, a sustained and systematic misery. The Duke was cold, controlling, obsessed with Blenheim as an institution rather than as a home. Consuelo was homesick, isolated, and had been denied the right to name her own children. But the legal machinery of aristocratic divorce was slow and expensive and socially catastrophic. The divorce was not finalized until 1921. Gladys Deacon waited 15 years. She moved through the social world. She maintained her friendships. Berenson, Proust, Rodin. She was invited everywhere. She was discussed everywhere. She was a figure of considerable cultural fascination. And she watched the wax move in her face. In her letters during this period, Berenson, the art historian who knew her perhaps better than anyone, begins to document a shift. The wit is still there. The intellectual ferocity is still there. But something else is entering the correspondence. An obsessiveness. A fixation on the Duke that Berenson, with increasing alarm, describes as consuming her from inside. She had made Charles Spencer Churchill the destination, the proof, the validation that would finally, formally confirm what she already knew, that she was exceptional, that she deserved to matter. They married in 1921, the same year the divorce came through. Gladys Deacon became Her Grace Gladys Spencer Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. She had arrived. The marriage lasted approximately 9 years before becoming, in practice, something darker than divorce, a cohabitation of mutual contempt conducted inside 300 rooms. The accounts from this period are almost operatic in their bleakness. The Duke, it emerged, was not a man who had been secretly in love with Gladys for 20 years. He was a man who had been infatuated with Gladys for 20 years, with the idea of her, with her beauty, with the social and psychological triumph of marrying the woman everyone wanted. But the man who had romanticized Gladys Deacon was constitutionally incapable of coexisting with the actual Gladys Deacon. because the actual Gladys Deacon had opinions and arguments and refused to be absorbed quietly into the function of a duke's wife. She redecorated parts of Blenheim. The Duke resented it. She befriended the staff with a directness that confused and unnerved the household hierarchy. She kept eccentric hours. She argued. She was, in the vocabulary of her era, difficult. In the vocabulary of ours, she was a woman who refused to disappear. And in the machinery of the aristocratic estate, in the architecture of power that Blenheim literally represented in stone, refusing to disappear was a structural failure. By the early 1930s, the Duke had, in effect, expelled her from Blenheim. He changed the locks, a detail so petty and so grotesque it belongs in a Gothic novel, which is precisely what their marriage had become. He left sheep in the formal gardens she had tended because he knew she would find them there and be unable to stop them. This was not passion curdled into indifference. This was methodical. This was a man who had decided that the way to handle a woman who would not obediently diminish was to make her diminishment the subject of daily, systematic humiliation. The Duke died in 1934. He left Gladys nothing. We need to step back now. Not away from Gladys, but around her. Because what happened to Gladys Deacon was not an anomaly. And it was not bad luck. And it was not simply the tragedy of loving the wrong man. It was the designed output of a specific economic and social technology. The dollar princess marriage system was not a cultural accident. It was a structured capital transfer mechanism operating at the intersection of two different flavors of patriarchal capitalism: the aristocratic feudal English model and the industrial extractive American model. Think of it as the first cross-border merger and acquisition wave in social capital history. The English aristocracy had an asset, hereditary legitimacy, the social infrastructure of centuries that was generating negative cash flow. The American industrial class had a different asset, liquid capital, with low social ROI in the domestic market. The transaction solved both problems. And the women were not the architects of the deal. They were the instrument through which the deal transferred. Every diamond necklace that a dollar princess wore to a Blenheim dinner party was connected by a chain you couldn't see but could absolutely trace to a specific set of working conditions in a specific factory or mine. Consuelo Vanderbilt's £2.5 million dowry came from William Vanderbilt's railroad empire, built on the suppression of worker organizing, on the use of private armies to break strikes, on the systematic underpayment of immigrant labor. The palace was financed by the suffering of people who would never see the inside of it. And the women who lived inside it, the dollar princesses, were simultaneously the beneficiaries of that extraction and its most visible, most legible victims. Caught between the machinery that produced the wealth and the machinery that absorbed it. Now let's be precise about the specific torture this system designed for someone like Gladys.
Because Gladys Deacon was different from the classic dollar princess in one crucial way. She was not primarily an economic instrument in this transaction. She was not wealthy enough to be that. She was something the system had even less room for. She was a woman who had pursued entry into this world on the basis of intellectual and personal desire. And that made her more vulnerable, not less. The dollar princess, as brutal as her position was, at least had the cold clarity of the economic contract. She knew what she was purchasing and what was being purchased. Some of them,
not all, but some, were able to build lives of genuine substance within the constraints. Consuelo Vanderbilt, after her escape, became a committed suffragist and social reformer. She used the platform her purchased title provided to do actual work in the world. Gladys had no such clarity. She had come to Blenheim wanting to be loved by it, recognized by it. She had spent 20 years auditioning for a role in a production that was never going to cast her as she imagined. And when she finally got the part, when she finally had the title, the palace, the position, she discovered that the part itself was the problem. The Duchess of Marlborough was not a person. She was a function, an administrative role in the management of an estate. She was expected to host, to defer, to reproduce heirs, and to visibly reflect the Duke's status without ever threatening to exceed it. Everything that made Gladys Deacon, the intelligence, the willfulness, the refusal to perform invisible femininity, was architecturally incompatible with what the role required. After the Duke died and left her nothing, Gladys did not simply fade away, though the mythology has tried to make that the ending. She moved between rented rooms. She became increasingly reclusive. She was committed briefly to a psychiatric institution in the 1960s, though the circumstances of that commitment and the diagnostic categories applied to her tell us considerably more about how mid-century psychiatry treated difficult older women than they tell us about Gladys's actual mental state. She lived until 1977. She was 96 years old. In her final decades, she kept dogs, dozens of them by some accounts. She lived alone. She gave interviews occasionally to researchers and journalists who had heard the legend and come to find her. She was sharp. She was acerbic. She was, by all accounts, still herself. Still the person who had argued philosophy with the greatest minds of the Belle Époque. She had survived everything the system had done to her. But survival is not vindication, and outlasting a system is not the same as escaping it. Here is the thing about Blenheim Palace. It is still there. You can visit it on weekends. There is a gift shop. You can buy a tea towel printed with the Spencer Churchill crest. The system that built it, the one that consumed Consuelo Vanderbilt's freedom and Gladys Deacon's face, and the labour of 10,000 unremembered workers. That system did not end with the Gilded Age. It did not end when the dollar princess market dried up. It shape-shifted. We are living through what historians are already calling the Second Gilded Age. The mathematics are disturbingly familiar. Concentrated capital in the hands of a vanishingly small number of people. Social hierarchies that look like meritocracy, but function like hereditary aristocracy. A market, and make no mistake, it is a market, for women's bodies, faces, and domestic labour that has simply moved its trading floor from the ballrooms of Newport to the algorithmically optimized platforms of the 21st century. The dollar princess has been replaced by different archetypes, different aesthetics, different vocabulary. But the underlying transaction is recognizable if you know how to look at it. When we watch the wax migrating in Gladys Deacon's face, we are watching what happens when a human being internalizes the values of a system that was never designed to accommodate their full humanity. When they begin to perform the surgery that the system demands, on their face, on their voice, on the parts of themselves that are too sharp, too complicated, too much. Gladys Deacon spoke 5 languages. She was friends with Proust. She had a mind that multiple Nobel laureates and world-class intellectuals described as genuinely exceptional. And the primary historical legacy she was handed for most of the century after her death was the story of a vain woman who destroyed her own beautiful face. That is not a coincidence. That is editorial. That is the system still working,
still insisting on the terms by which it will allow her to be remembered. The question I want to leave you with is not a comfortable one. Gladys Deacon was an exceptional person in exceptional circumstances, but the mechanisms that destroyed her, the transactional marriage economy, the narrowing of women's value to their physical proximity to an impossible ideal, the institutional punishment of female intelligence and agency, those mechanisms did not require an exceptional person to operate. They were running quietly on everyone. And if we are honest, genuinely, historically honest, the question is not whether those mechanisms have been dismantled. The question is whether we would recognize them if they were operating on us. I want to know what you think. We have spent decades debating whether women like Gladys Deacon, brilliant, willful, unconventional, were tragic victims or active participants in their own destruction. But that binary might be the most insidious part of the system's legacy. It forces us to assign individual blame for structural outcomes. So here is the question for the comments. Was Gladys Deacon's tragedy the result of her own choices, her obsession, her self-modification, her pursuit of a world that couldn't contain her? Or was it the inevitable output of a capitalist patriarchy that converts women's desire for power into the very instrument of their subjugation? And if it was the system, what does it mean that we are still, right now, in a world where that question doesn't have an obvious answer? Leave me your thoughts below. I read every single one.